Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Geography 1140, Humans' Role in Changing the Face of Planet Earth. It is the 25th of February. We are on Tuesday of week 7. We're talking about urban environments today. Let's take a look at the syllabus. Switch over to sharing. There you go. So we're down here in week 7. Last week, you had your test. How was that? Went pretty good? Did you get any questions you already seen before? Hopefully, a couple of them. Did you watch the review video from Lauren? Did that help? Maybe.
I watched it. I skipped through the parts that I think are interesting.
Cool. Hopefully, we'll try. She'll do a better one next time. But hopefully with something, and I'll be here next time when we do a review, so we'll do an in-person one, but we'll record it for people as well. But shout out to Lauren for putting that together. You also had your position paper number 2. How'd that go? Went pretty well. Enjoy the articles. Articles or videos? Which one did you do?
Hummus Island.
Uh-huh.
That's cool.
Yeah. Hummus Island coming towards them. Anybody else like one? Find something you like? Yeah. Hopefully. Find something. There's 2 more. So we'll get some feedback to you on that pretty quick. We're going to do urban environments and waste management this week. This is out of order. I switched them around just because there was a section in urban environments on waste management, and it seemed kind of silly to do it and then come back to it in like post spring break. So I figured I'd switch them around and put them together this week. So we're doing chapters 10 and chapters 17. That's why it's a little strange. You have a discussion board number 6, which is on waste. We'll talk about that more on Thursday when we talk about our waste chapter. But just as kind of a preview, you're going to be looking at the waste your household generates. So if you might want to start thinking about that earlier, it'll help you answer that question. So just kind of pay attention to your trash, what percentage you're recycling, and what you're doing with it, if you're composting it, if you're throwing it in the landfill or whatever. We also have another quiz this week, quiz number 6 coming up. And remember, you only have 12 quizzes this semester. So this is your halfway point on quizzes. That's kind of cool. We got this week, and then next week we're going to be doing climate change and acidification. And then we got spring break. So if you are kind of falling behind, or if you haven't got those position papers or your test taken care of, please do that pretty quick, because some of those assignments are going to start to close on you pretty quick. So please take care of that. Okay. So today we're going to be doing urban environments and the ways that impacts the environment. There we go. I'm going to move this down so I can see my tabs. This here. Okay. So this is I think it's a really interesting topic, because it really is at the intersection between kind of the cultural geography, kind of stuff that I'm interested in, how people transform the landscape, and natural environments, right? Because you have these natural places where people build cities, and oftentimes it's the natural features of those places that make people want to live there, right? Whether it's like New York City being on the Hudson, the mouth of the Hudson, emptying into the Atlantic, where you can kind of conduct transatlantic trade, or you have kind of the Egyptian civilizations rising up on the Nile, or the Mesopotamian civilizations on the Tigris and Euphrates. If you're interested in that kind of thing, I'm teaching origins next semester. You should take that class. The geography of planet Earth really has a lot to do with where we place cities. Cities are not just kind of randomly distributed on the landscape. If you have a kind of a theoretical model like central place theory, it says that big cities should be spread out pretty evenly around the world. But when we look at big cities, which we're going to do in just a few minutes, we'll see that that's not the case, that they tend to cluster in certain places, or there are certain areas for political as well as geographic regions where there are more people than others, right? What do you think are some things that maybe would, either be a benefit or a detriment to placing a city in a certain environment? Yeah, right. And there are pretty big cities and places that don't have water, like Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, right? The capital of Saudi Arabia doesn't have a lot of water, but they got a lot of money from oil, so they make it work, right? But typically a city should have water, and it should have enough water for its residents, for both municipal as well as for hopefully some kind of agriculture to sustain that population. So a good supply of water that could be from the ocean, but more regularly because the ocean's salty and you have to do something with that to desalinate it. Usually that's on some kind of river. Occasionally it's lakes, but rivers are a little bit better because you get that constant flow of water. So you're getting fresh water in, and if you put some kind of waste in the river, it goes away instead of a lake which just kind of sits there. So we got water. What else might I want to look for in placing my city? Good afternoon. Yes.
Yeah, he came to see you, he wanted to see you at work, and he's convinced that you guys have donuts in here.
Oh, unfortunately, we don't have donuts. You might check somewhere else. They might have popcorn in the popcorn building today. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, thanks, everyone.
Good luck.
Tell your professor bring donuts.
Yeah, it's a great idea. Who wants extra credit? All right, let's resume. That's not on tape. Okay, so let's resume. What are some other factors which might be beneficial or detrimental to a city's future? We've got water. It's a big one.
What they can achieve.
Yeah, and that might be in terms of, again, natural resources. Reason we see large scale industrialization in like Pennsylvania and the Great Lakes region is it's coming together of like the coal from Appalachia. You can transport steel on the Great Lakes and on the Ohio River. So you have these kind of natural formations of either waterways or of natural resources, but you also have kind of the human capital there to like work in the factories and provide workers for your industries. So you got people, you got water, you got natural resources. What are some things that might be detrimental to the future of your city? Rats and disease, right? And having to deal with one of the things that I think I keep pushing this origins class, but I think it's really interesting because we talk about how we as humans, for 99% of our human history, are mobile hunting and gathering band populations living in groups of like 100 people or less. And now it's almost impossible to think of that, right? We are think of ourselves as really urban species or at least suburban. And like, but humans aren't really adapted for living in really close quarters. Like rats have been living together for millions, tens of millions of years, but we as humans have only got 5 or 6 thousand years of living very close quarters. So we're not really adapted for that, right? So we use the instead of biological adaptations, we have to use cultural adaptations. We're going to talk about a bunch of those today and tomorrow, especially with dealing with waste and how we get rid of all this trash as well as human waste when we live in a city. So we have disease problems. There's often problems of natural resources, whether that's water, whether that's other types of resources such as agriculture to provide for the city, as well as when you do have these kind of disasters, which we'll talk about disasters quite a bit today, whether they are man-made or natural, right? You could have a volcano explode, or you could have a chemical waste accident in a city. Either way, they're going to be a lot more hazardous in a city just because people are really close together. And if you have a toxic spill out in the country, maybe a few people or 100 people are affected, but thousands of people can die in the city. So cities are really interesting because they do bring together those two sides of geography. And they're also interesting because we as a species are becoming increasingly urbanized. Like I said, like 6,000 years ago, we don't have really before that we don't really have anything that we can consider urban, right? But really even in the last century, we're becoming increasingly urban, right? Beginning of the 19th century, London is a big city, but today, we have lots of big cities that are much bigger. The number of cities with more than 1 million people have quadrupled in the past 25 years. And we've seen the rise, which I'll show you in just a second, of what we call mega cities, these 10 to 20 million people conglomerations, right? And this is again, it's very unprecedented in human history, but because we live in it, we just kind of think it's normal. But this is cities, and the growth of cities has a major impact on the local environment, right? And I'm from a city, not like a big city, from Orlando. It's like a medium city. But it is a very fast growing city. It was a city of like 100,000, couple, maybe 200,000 when I was a kid, to well over 1 million at this point and stretching across 4 counties, right? And you see all these kind of environmental consequences that I talk about here, right? Like places that when I was a kid used to be like, oh, that used to be a farm, or that used to be a forest, and now it's a Publix or a suburban housing development, right? That used to be a wetlands, and now they've paved over that to make a shopping mall or a plaza. And now when it rains, instead of the water being caught there, and it all floods into the streets, right? That used to be a river, and used to have this kind of area of natural space around it, and it was much cleaner. But now you got parking lots right up to the edge of the river, and they become almost, gullies or canals for moving waste. And so you have these natural environments which have changed. And it's different living kind of in Portales or Clovis, right, where the pace of growth is slower, and you still see that. We do have kind of new areas of town. If you've been out by the hospital, you can see they've been trying to build a new development down there for a decade or two, and there are new areas in Clovis, but they're fairly small urban areas. It takes going to somewhere like maybe Albuquerque till you really start to see kind of the scale of urban sprawl. Um, when we talk about kind of the urbanization of the human species, again, over the last century or so, we've gone from about 13% at the beginning of the 20th century, so like 1900, 13% of the world's population lived in cities. And by the end of the 20th century, it was over 50%. And by 2050, it's supposed to be over 66, or 2/3 of the Earth's population. And that's pretty amazing in 150 years to go from 13% to 2/3 of the world's population. Again, it's kind of unprecedented in human history, and we actually don't really know what's going to happen when you put all these people into a very small space. And this map I think is really interesting. The darker green shows a higher percentage of urban populations as compared to rural populations. What do you notice about this map? What countries are still primarily rural as compared to more urbanized populations? What do you think? Can you see that map? Yeah, right. You got large areas of sub-Saharan Africa. Saharan Africa tends to be like Northern Africa tends to be more urbanized because people are living here along the Mediterranean. But in sub-Saharan Africa, lots of this kind of lighter color, as well as India, Southeast Asia, into kind of Central Asia as well, and kind of the near Pacific over here. As well as some of like Central America and some parts of South America. And then we see more urbanization, such as in areas with a lot of urbanization, like in Australia, where you have almost like 80% of the or 90% of the population living in a very small area, along the coast down here, while you got big areas of the outback with no population. Same within Brazil, you got a few mega cities along the coast, and then large sections of Amazonia, which are largely lacking in big cities. So we can kind of see that this urbanization is not really evenly distributed, even within a place like Europe, right? Things that are fairly close together. You can have, Poland is much less urbanized than, say, Finland, which is kind of just across the Baltic here. Same with, England and France, France being much more urbanized, England having more population out in the countryside. But beyond just kind of looking at cities and the percent of urbanization, we can actually look at those cities and where are the biggest cities in the world. These are what we call mega cities. These are cities of 10 million or more. And I think it's pretty interesting. I'm old, you know, I was born in 1980. And in 1980, there were three mega cities, right? You had New York, Mexico City, and Tokyo. That was like the biggest cities in the world, right? And now there's a whole lot more, right? By 2020 or by 2000, we had 18 mega cities. And by 2025, this year, it's supposed to be 29 or 30 different mega cities. And again, these are going to show you these blue dots are the old megacities, New York, Mexico, and Tokyo. The purple dots right here, you see a couple of these are kind of the 2000s, the millennials, and then the red dots are the new up and coming cities. What do you notice about the distribution of these as well? Where are most of those purple and red dots, the new megacities that have, what was that?
Asia.
Yeah, we got a whole bunch in Asia, right? We got kind of right here in China, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 mega cities. We got in, you know, between India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 mega cities. We got a couple in the islands, Philippines, and Indonesia down here. And then in Europe, it's again, it's much more, they're kind of spread out, right? Moscow, Paris, Istanbul, 3 in Africa, with kind of Congo and Nigeria being rapidly increasing populations, both in absolute terms as well as in people moving to the cities. And then we got kind of, again, South America, which is interesting. We have kind of these millennial mega cities here on kind of the Atlantic coast, Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, and Buenos Aires, and then the kind of up and comers in Lima, Peru, and in Colombia up in the Andes, right? And again, and LA kind of joining the crew in 2000. But if you look again at most of the United States, you know, we're very coastal country. And that most of those big cities are located near the coast, and we don't really have them here in the heartland. So big cities are on the rise, but they are not eternal, right? Like cities kind of rise and fall, and we can see throughout history, certain cities have been more important than others, right? At one time, Baghdad is kind of the center of learning and education, and now it's kind of a smaller city. While other city in Cordoba in Spain or Toledo is another one, which used to be a very big, important city, but no longer is, right? While we see new areas kind of coming up. And this is another chart. This is again the megacity chart. But what I think is interesting is it shows growth in the last little bit, right? This isn't like growth back in the day. This is growth like in your lifetime, right? The blue bar is 2011 and the green bar is 2025. Some of those bars are really not in the right spot. Like Mexico City lost part of its bar over here. But again, where do you see the areas with green, with a whole lot of green compared to blue, are going to be cities which are growing really fast. Cities with a lot of blue and not a lot of green are growing pretty slow. Which cities do you think are growing pretty fast? Where are they located?
Asia.
Yeah, these are primarily Asian cities where you have, you know, here in South India is really wild. You got more green than blue. So the city is like more than doubled in the last 15 years. While you have kind of these legacy cities like Moscow finally crossed over the 10 million mark, but you know, most of that growth is kind of legacy growth, and it's only very little bit of growth recently. So there's a whole bunch of difference between how fast these cities are growing as well. You know, sub-Saharan Africa is another case where you have almost doubling the populations of these cities in a very short amount of time. So that just kind of like, I think, lays the groundwork for why talk about cities, because they are, you know, rapidly expanding, and we are becoming our increasingly urban population, even in my lifetime. But why talk about it for this class? And it's because the things that make a city go, especially a really fast expanding city, are things that affect the environment, and they affect the environment in a whole lot of ways. What do you think are some ways that a expanding city might change, especially negatively change, its local environment? Yeah, right. You're going to have to make it regular. If you're a builder, you don't want really hilly terrain with gullies and canyons and hills, and you want it flat, right? When I lived in West Virginia, you know, they would always advertise these prime building spots, which were former strip mines and mountaintop removal sites because it was flat. You didn't have any trees on it. You didn't have any gullies. So you could just put your Walmart or Family Dollar or your Tudor's biscuits there, right? It was much easier. So whether that's mountaintop removal or whether that's filling in wetlands and things like that, we get a literal reconstruction of the face of the earth. What are some other ways, maybe less literally, the earth has changed by the expanding of cities? How about for water? Does it change the water profile? How might it change water? Yeah, you got waste. So you got, again, maybe you have big factories which are putting things into the water, but maybe you also have, a lot more cars or buses or homes that are putting things into the water. Yeah.
Also, more people are consuming the water
Yeah.
that are deprescent or clean.
Yeah, I was actually surprised. I was looking at Albuquerque stuff, and they didn't actually, they consisted completely on groundwater until 2008, which is wild because it's, on the middle of the desert and they actually have a river right there. And then they've started using other systems since then, but especially in an area like this, you're going to be using a lot of water and if you have a city that's growing, it's going to be using those resources pretty fast. And we'll talk about some of the consequences of that, right? You're going to run out of water, but also your city can literally sink as you remove the water from underground. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about trash. What about air or atmosphere? Do you think an expanding city can make the atmosphere a little worse? Yeah, right. I don't know if you've ever been. Have any of you lived in a big city?
I lived shortest in San Diego.
Yeah.
I can see the smog.
Yeah, we'll talk about LA smog. And it's just, I lived for a while in a city called Quetzaltenango, which is in the highlands of Guatemala. And it was like probably some of the worst smog I've ever lived in because the city's at like 9,000 feet. And then the mountains are all around it. So it's in the valley. And they use like old diesel buses and they have factories and stuff. So the smog all just kind of sits in the basin, right? And you get these kind of negative health consequences for people living there. If you have asthma or respiratory diseases, it's a whole lot worse in cities than it can be. They send people up to the mountains for good, clean air. So there's lots of negative things that can happen in the city that we're going to take a look at. And another one of these is that, even in places like Singapore, they even actually make more land, right? The Singapore is an island and it's a pretty small island country. And you see this elsewhere in kind of island nations where you actually get kind of the conversion of seafloor or kind of these shallow marshy areas into more land to build the city because there's just not enough of it. We're going to talk about some of the environmental impacts, right? We've talked about smog and air pollution. There's a loss of biodiversity unless you really plan for it to like make green spaces into your city. Oftentimes, the plants and animals that live there have a pretty hard time, and they're replaced by city species of things, right? You get pigeons, you get raccoons and possums, things that are pretty adapted to living with humans, while things that are maybe a little bit more delicate or more endemic to that area often get pushed aside. We'll talk about sewage and garbage just a ton on Thursday. But one of the things that affects, especially here in the Southwest, is that cities are just hot, right? I don't know if you've ever been in a city in the summer. It's pretty miserable, right? Anybody been to Albuquerque or Phoenix or Tucson in the summer? Right? It's a whole lot hotter even than the surrounding area. You're like, oh, the desert's hot. But then you like go into Tucson, you're like, ah, this is like really hot, right? Why is it so hot in the city, do you think, compared to, just out here or something? Like if you're in the fields, right, around Portales. Why might it be hotter in the city? What we call the heat island effect. Yeah.
Wouldn't it be something similar to what's going on with the deserts where, the concrete's this bright material.
Yep.
It bounces heat off of it. That goes up to the sky. It's trapped in probably by carbon dioxide or whatever from factories.
Yeah.
Comes back, gets reflected again, and so it's just a ping pong effect.
Yeah, and you also have kind of going along with that, right? You have because it is so paved over, you don't get a lot of groundwater absorption. You don't have maybe standing groundwater like you might have in some places, but you also don't have the plants, right? In a lot of places, even if it's deserty or scrubby, or high plains. Like here, you had grass or something, which is much more absorbs a lot more of that heat than parking lot or roads or something. So I want to show you just a really quick video. We have a lot of time today, so I'm gonna have a couple of videos. This is only like a 2-minute video really about why it's so hot in the cities. So when you watch this, think about what are the reasons for it and what you might do if you were a city planner to make it a little bit less hot. All right, so we just watched the video on heat islands. So tell me, what would you do if you were a city planner and you were in charge of reducing heat-related deaths? Like you saw in the video, heat-related deaths are the #1 environmental cause of death in America, which is kind of wild. You would think it's tornadoes or lightning or flash floods or fires, but it's heat. So what could you do to make cities a little safer if you were in charge? What would you do?
Plant more trees.
Plant more trees, right? Like put some trees out there. That helps. You can get a little shade, both for you personally, but also cools down the environment and releases some water vapor back in the atmosphere. What else?
That's hard to say. I don't know if you've ever been to Australia, but they have that big reflective building that for a while was like evaporating birds out of the atmosphere. And just explode.
Huh.
So I guess change materials of the building.
Yeah. Or even just paint them. Like I thought that was interesting, the difference in the color of the building. And I also thought the thing about the grids is really interesting, that cities that are not laid out in this kind of logical pattern tend to be hotter, right? Which is really interesting, right? We have this kind of modern view of art of that a city that's organized is a better city, but maybe that makes it hotter. It makes it less livable to be kind of rationally organized. So I think that's a really cool video, and it's something probably most people don't think of when they think of why cities might be so hot. Okay, let's go back to this. Yeah. The second kind of disaster that happens in cities, and we've kind of already talked about this, is smog. What is smog? You all know? Yeah.
It could be, it's usually smoke with some maybe chemical byproducts that are gaseous, that are emitted into the atmosphere by, just human activities, factories, driving, anything like that, that could create a smog.
Yeah. And the thing that makes that makes it a smog is that it's close to the ground, right? Like a lot of stuff is released in the atmosphere, and on a clear day can go up. But oftentimes, when environmental, the conditions around these cities, whether it's the kind of geography of it, places like California where you're kind of between the ocean and the mountains tend to get a lot of smog. Like I was saying, the city I lived in Guatemala had a lot of smog because it was up in the kind of the valley and a high altitude. This is a kind of when these atmospheric byproducts tend to hang low and really affect people's health. The name smog is a made-up word from Victorian era London, which was smoke and fog mixed together. And this was especially kind of like if you think of like the Charles Dickens era, this is the era of smokestacks in London and people burning coal in their houses to stay warm. And it causes, terrible pollution, especially for people who have kind of respiratory issues. It can really affect them. And we tend to think of this as something that happened, that's back in the Ebenezer Scrooge days or something like that. But this was a phenomenon well into the 20th century, into the mid 20th century. And in fact, thousands of people, have died in the 20th century in London alone just from smog, right? And we think of smog, but it's really a kind of a major environmental health hazard that they've been attempting in recent years to improve the quality of the air. And you can see this graph over here. This is the city of London. And you can just see how, we'll take a look at this video of the Great London Smog of the 1952. But this really kind of spurred conservation efforts to get to reduce the smog in the city. So let's take a look at the Great London Smog.
It started on the 5th.
I think it's a really interesting video about smog in London and the negative impacts it had on people there. I was reading some of the YouTube comments on that video, and one of the top ones was talking about a woman remembering her mother going through that smog and saying that it was so thick that hospitals actually had employed blind people to help, people get around because they were used to not being able to see anyway. And it had more than 4,000 excess deaths during that time. And like they said in the video, it's pretty shocking when you run out of coffins in London because there's so many extra deaths. Again, like you saw in the video, 1952, this killer smog happened. By 1956, the government decides to do something about it and start to put regulations on both industrial sources as well as people's burning coal in their homes and switching people to natural gas and oil. And again, you can see this is the sulfur oxide concentration in the air. And almost immediately, like that new law is passed in 56, by 1965, you're already down below 300. And by 1975, you're almost down to like 125. And by 1985, you're down below 50, right? And it's pretty good today. So which is pretty an amazing turnaround for a city like that. And I think it's because it is this kind of local problem, right? A lot of the problems that really vex us environmentally are ones that cross borders or that affect millions of people, and people kind of argue about them. But when you have something contained to like a city, it's often easier to make to fix what's going on if you have the resources in a city like London does. The problem is that not a lot of cities do that, right? A lot of these kind of new urban areas are some of the worst for smog, right? Especially you can see like in Beijing, if you've ever seen pictures of that. Beijing smog. And it looks very similar to what you would expect in like London, turn of the century London or something like that. I haven't. Like that? Yeah. What's it like?
Essentially like that one right there. You'll wake up in the morning, you can't see 3 feet in front of you.
That's wild.
We get up for PT at like 5
Uh-huh.
a.m.
Just in the city? Yeah. Huh.
And it wasn't, well, in Seoul, like the main
Yeah.
concentration of it, but it would trickle out to like where the base was, and
Huh.
the red light district and stuff around it.
Huh.
It's pretty rough.
And people get sick from it? Yeah.
And so I for one got sick immediately, but several like the army guys I was with at the time sick because we go out and party in the weekends and then come back just horribly sick because all the smog.
Huh.
Desks are not used to it here.
Yeah. Huh. Well, we don't have that issue here, thankfully, but it's one of those issues that really impact cities, and then it's oftentimes kind of this push and pull between economic drivers. Well, we have these factories, we need to make money. It costs money to have pollution scrubbers, where it's not as efficient in terms of making money. But at what cost, right? Especially to the not only the wildlife, the plants and animals that live there, but to the people who live there as well. Yeah, here's Beijing, people riding around with their mask on. Here's LA, lots of smog. We'll talk more about other kinds of factors through some of these other chapters, because a lot of the issues facing kind of urban life are some of the other chapters in your book, where it's water quality, whether it's habitat loss, whether it's biodiversity loss. We'll kind of come back to those. But I did want to kind of talk a little bit more. Well, again, we're going to come back. We're going to spend a lot of time on trash, but check out the trash section. One of the things that often happens in cities, I did want to kind of look at this, is that they subside, which means that they can often sink, right? We often don't think about this, like cities are sinking. But this happens all over the world. In the United States, in the Imperial Valley in California, it's probably one of the biggest areas, and you can see signs. They have like telephone poles where it's, this is what the land used to be, up here at the very top of the telephone, like 1930 and then 1950, and now you're 40 or 50 feet down below where the land used to be. And this is because these are often areas that have water under the ground, which is really cool if you're putting a city in, right? Because you want to be able to pump that groundwater out and and use it for people in the city. Or if you're doing mining around the city, or if you're doing reclamation, oftentimes like so Singapore or somewhere like Tokyo, which is building up on kind of these marshy areas. As it settles, they can sink down, and a lot of these places are sinking. Some places are pretty stable, but a lot of places are sinking pretty fast, right? This is Taipei, Taiwan is sinking like 10 centimeters or 100 millimeters a year. So it's 1 centimeter a year. Um, Other places, like even here in New Mexico, like near Denning in New Mexico, they have about a centimeter loss of height a year. Your textbook talks about Tehran and Iran is also suffering this. And this can have lots of major impacts on a city. What do you think could happen if your city is literally sinking into the ground? What are some negative consequences? Yeah.
Well, since the foundation is
Yeah.
sinking inward, that could, maybe if one area is a little more stable than the other that the building is built on, the building could maybe collapse lopsided.
Yeah.
There was out and around the countryside, there's a bunch of old abandoned buildings from, from people who own that land. And one I remember in particular it's like from the drive from Tucumcari to a little town house, New Mexico.
Yeah.
I don't remember where exactly it is, but there's this one building where just one side of it has completely collapsed inwards while the other is still standing.
Yeah, just there was like a soft spot or a sinking spot there. Mexico City is a great example. Like we talked about a couple weeks ago, Mexico City's basically used to be a series of lakes and these kind of floating islands that were basically filled in to make what's today Mexico City. And you get massive subsiding. Here's downtown Mexico. You can see literal buildings, sinking into the ground where the doors don't fit anymore. Kind of in the central square in Mexico City, you see like the cathedral has scaffolding on it, almost like Leaning Tower of Pisa style to like keep it from falling over. You got these. I'm trying to find this picture. Yeah, here's a picture. Of just this is again in Mexico City like a sculpture where the land was in 1960 and 1970 80 90 2000 2010, right? And it's just sunk so much over the years. So you can have these kind of structural issues which affect buildings. What else might happen?
Flooding creates like a bowl.
Yeah, it creates, especially if you're near the coast, right? That can be really bad. Is that like in Miami as it kind of sinks down, near where I'm from, it's actually sinking. And if you're right next to the ocean, right? If you're at like 3 or 4 feet above sea level and you sink another foot or two, that can make a really big difference in terms of, especially when you have like hurricanes or you have flooding or things like that. Another thing is that as that water goes down, it can, especially cities near the coast, you can have issues with your water table. Is this happening in Israel? As they use up the aquifer, especially near the coast, you can get seepage of salt water into that aquifer, which can ruin the drinking water that you do have in those kind of cities. So it's a big issue and it's an expensive issue to fix, right? It's one of those issues that often is pretty people don't really think about it while it's happening. You're like, oh, I'm just going to like use this water. But then by the time you're pumping fresh water back into the ground to keep salinity down or to raise up the ground or to make it so your city isn't sinking into the ground, it can become very expensive. All right. So how many of you had ever thought about land subsiding before? It's not often something that comes up in popular discourse, especially with climate change. We often think about sea level rise making these cities uninhabitable, but I think the combination of the rise and the fall of the land itself, is really a double whammy for a lot of these places. And a lot of these cities, right, are kind of often in third world places, often don't have a lot of resources to deal with that. What are some of the ways that they said that maybe cities could deal with problems like this? What are some strategies? Again, if you were urban planner, what would you do?
You said one of the cities was putting water back into.
Mm-hmm. You have to inject water back in the ground to make it more stable, but that means you got to have the water to do it. Like we saw in Jakarta, if people don't have drinking water, there's probably going to be a lot of political pressure against like, oh, why are you just throwing away that good water, right? Or why are you spending the money on these kind of schemes when you could provide us water? What other strategies were they using?
Big wall.
Big wall, right? And a great, and that can work, and it works often pretty well for a while until it doesn't, And like New Orleans is a great case of that. A city that's kind of sinking, and it is actually below sea level at this point. They build big walls around it, levees and dams to keep water in check, and it usually works great until it doesn't, and then you get Hurricane Katrina's, and you get kind of this massive flooding into these areas which are well below sea level, and as the barriers actually fall, it comes rushing in into these areas, right? So again, there's lots of strategies. You can keep building higher and higher. You can fill things in. You can try to change the upstream, right? If you're prone to flooding, you can build defenses upstream or have more marshy areas. But again, it's really difficult to do it without money, right? And most of the cities that you see that have successfully kind of pushed back against it, whether it's Tel Aviv in Israel or whether it's Shanghai in China or Paris has basically stopped sinking. It's usually places that have money and to kind of do these kind of both politically and economically challenging decisions in order to kind of stop the sinking of their cities. We have a few minutes left. Let's go through the last 5 or 6 slides. Yep, there's Mexico City. It's sinking. Yep, and Tokyo as well. One of the other issues that can affect cities are disasters, right? And we've already looked at the London smog, but just because of the kind of close urban environment, when things go wrong in cities, whether it's explosions from gas leaks or leaks of chemicals and pesticides into areas, or big fires or mudslides, or literally garbage mountains falling in on slums and things like that. When it happens in a city, it can happen big time, right? And here's some of the kind of major disasters which have happened in cities. And we don't really have time for it because it's a little bit of a longer video, but one of the worst cities, urban kind of disasters is the Union Carbide gas leak in India here in 1984. And you can check this video. It's about 10 minutes long online. And it just kind of shows you how, again, when you have these industrial disasters in the city, you go from kind of a mechanical failure of the factory to these kind of human failures, these political failures to stop it, and then trying to figure out what to do to compensate. And oftentimes, again, these things happen in often the worst, areas that are often very poor because of what we will call environmental justice or environmental injustice, right? This idea that oftentimes it's the poor areas of the world and of the country which have these toxic waste or have garbage dumps or have factories located in them, while people who live in Hollywood or the Hamptons or something don't necessarily have those same consequences. So this idea of environmental justice and this idea that that oftentimes the people who are paying the cost of these environmental disasters are not the people who are getting the benefits. And finally, they end the chapter on this idea of kind of sustainability. We talked about this kind of going all the way back to like chapter 3 in the book. And that cities, because of their kind of central place in the 21st century, are really a good place to start when we think about like how to fix some of these environmental problems. Because while they are super concentrated and can like, when something goes wrong in a city, it can like really make things terrible there. They are also very concentrated and can be much easier to fix, right? Like when you talk about the London smog problem, you can fix the problems in a city and it can affect lots of people in a very positive way, right? Like, or if you stop the city from sinking, it can be actually like affect lots of people and improve their lives versus kind of doing something over a more spread out area. So there's lots of ways that we can do this, right? They talk about energy consumption, switching to more efficient energy systems, things that are renewable, having energy on site, especially with photovoltaic or with windmills to make your energy there and not have to kind of produce it elsewhere and bring it in. To have better planning in your cities, like we saw earlier, having less of a tight grid, having more green space, having it so you don't have to drive everywhere. I thought that when I was in Albuquerque, there was something literally across the road that I had to drive through because it was too dangerous to walk across all the roads. So to drive like 5 minutes down and around to get to this place that I could literally see. So having it more pedestrian friendly, more walkable, 5-minute cities, that kind of thing. And having more trees and green space, right? These are often, some of these things can be expensive, but they can have lots of benefits long term for the city, as well as for the people who live there, right? So lots of things that we can do. And one of the biggest challenges facing cities, which we're going to talk about next time, is this idea of waste. Cities, one of the biggest problems that facing any city is trash. And this can be both like everyday trash, like I ate a hamburger before I came here and it came in a piece of paper or a wrapper and it has a bag and a napkin and all that stuff. That all gets thrown away. But there's also much more hazardous kind of stuff, toxic waste, heavy metals, radiation, all that kind of stuff, which can also end up in our cities and their landfills. So next time we're going to talk about this idea of waste, both solid waste as well as liquid waste, how we deal with it, and what are some of the problems maybe caused by poor disposal of waste in these areas. Okay, that's all that we have time for today. Check out that uranium carbide gas leak video if you want to learn more about that. And we'll talk about waste next time. So cool. See you next time.